It's now time to do that thing we do every single episode, where I talk about why I'm terrible at this whole hosting thing, and then spend the rest of the episode talking about something completely unrelated. You know the drill. Let's get into it. Okay, now that that's over with, let's actually talk about today's subject, Ammonius of Athens. Very little is known about the life of Ammonius, but what we do know was pieced together from a handful of surviving letters. By the Roman philosopher Pliny the Younger, who describes him as an old man when he was still relatively young. According to Pliny, Ammonius was born in Athens, hence his name, and was educated there before moving to Rome. He studied rhetoric under the famous teacher, Ammonius of Athens, who was a student of Epicurus and a proponent of the Stoics' philosophy, a practice which involved controlling one's emotions through reason and living in harmony with nature and the divine order of the cosmos. Ammonius later became a teacher himself and taught rhetoric in taverns and forums. One day he was giving a lesson in the Forum Magnum when Pliny, who was a student of his, was summoned by Caesar to speak on behalf of a friend named Cluvius Rufus, who had been accused of extortion. After successfully defending his friend, Pliny returned to Ammonius's class only to find that the teacher had been arrested for criticizing the emperor. Although he was quickly released after pleading, Ammonius decided to flee Rome with Pliny and spent the rest of his life traveling around the Mediterranean. The two friends eventually settled in the city of Bithynia, where they both held administrative positions and taught rhetoric. Ammonius remained in Bithynia for the rest of his life, though he did occasionally travel to Athens to visit his family. His former student, Pliny, would later become governor of Bithynia, and he would come to depend on his old teacher's advice, even in matters of statecraft. When Pliny was writing a letter to the Emperor Trajan about how best to deal with the Jewish revolt led by Shimon bar Kokheba, he sought out Ammonius and asked for his thoughts on the matter. According to Pliny, Ammonius simply replied, "You have my full approval," and with that, he strolled off to get a haircut. He was probably right, though. But while such anecdotes paint a picture of a mild-mannered and somewhat eccentric old man, Ammonius's reputation as a teacher was legendary. In fact, one of the few surviving works attributed to him, a letter addressed to his pupil, Herennius, begins with a passage that reads, "I have been told that you want my instructions, but I ask what sort of instructions, whether those which are commonly given or those which you ought to follow." This sets the tone for the rest of the letter, which is basically just a philosophical pep talk, and it reveals much about Ammonius's approach to teaching. Throughout the letter, Ammonius refuses to give Herennius the answers he's looking for, instead insisting that his pupil discover them for himself. Here's an example. Herennius asks, "What is the chief task of a philosopher?" To which Ammonius replies, "I ask you, what do you think?" When Herennius guesses that the task is to imitate the wise, Ammonius responds by saying that, although it's important to learn from the philosophers of the past, he believes it's more important to focus on the present moment. He writes, "What use is there in imitating Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, if you cannot even endure the present hour? If you cannot make yourself happy now, of what value will it be to you to have Marcus Aurelius Antoninus as an example, or any other philosopher or any other good man? For what is all the instruction in the world worth if you do not practice it?" This passage encapsulates Ammonius's entire philosophy, which was essentially a less rigid version of Stoicism focused on living a virtuous life in the present moment rather than worrying about the past or future. He believed that true wisdom could only be achieved by following one's own reason and intuition, and he encouraged his students to trust themselves and take responsibility for their own actions. Unfortunately, not much else is known about Ammonius outside of his relationship with Pliny the Younger. His date of birth and death are unknown, and most of what we know about him comes from Pliny's letters. Despite this, historians have come to generally agree that Ammonius was a real historical figure, and that much of what we know about him, at least in broad strokes, is accurate. This is in part due to the fact that several ancient writers, including Plutarch, refer to him by name and describe him as a leading philosopher of his day. Unfortunately, none of these references contain any new information about him, so we still don't know much about his life or his teachings. But the very fact that so many ancient writers knew of Ammonius shows that he must have been quite well known in his own time. In recent years, scholars have begun to question whether or not Ammonius was a Christian. and some have even suggested that he may have been the author of the New Testament book of Hebrews. However, there is no evidence to support these claims, and most scholars reject them outright. There are a few passages in Pliny's letters that could be interpreted as evidence of Christianity, but these are almost certainly referring to the religion as a whole, rather than to any particular sect. Furthermore, the traditional view that Ammonius was a pagan philosopher is supported by a number of ancient sources, including Plutarch, who explicitly states that Ammonius was a follower of Pythagoras. Regardless, it seems clear that Ammonius was deeply spiritual, and that his philosophy was deeply intertwined with his religious beliefs. In his letter to Hieronymus, for example, he writes, "When you have passed through life in this way, you will leave this life without reproach, without regret, and you will be able to say, like the philosopher Pythagoras, 'I have completed the circuit.'" This passage suggests that Ammonius saw philosophy as a kind of spiritual practice, and that he believed that the goal of philosophy was to live a life that was in harmony with the divine order of the cosmos. Although most of Ammonius's work is lost, what remains shows us that he was a brilliant teacher and a profound thinker. His emphasis on personal responsibility and the importance of living in the present moment is a powerful message that can resonate with people from all walks of life. It's no surprise that he was so revered in his own time, that his former students continued to seek him out for advice, even after he had retired from teaching. While we may never know everything there is to know about Ammonius, what little we do know is enough to show us that he was a truly great philosopher. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us keep bringing these videos to you, consider becoming a patron through the link in the description. A huge thank you to our current patrons whose names you can see on screen right now. As a quick reward for sticking around until the end of the video, here's a picture of a cat wearing headphones. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.